Almighty God, we give you thanks for another opportunity to gather to deliberate on important matters of the nation. As we go through today's proceedings, may you grant us clear minds and thoughts and focused attention on the people's business, and may all our deliberations may be to the glory and honor of thy blessed name. Amen.
Thank you very much, Madam. So the Standing Finance Committee of the House of Representatives, consisting of all members of the House, is now convened. You will remember that on the 12th day of April 2022, the House of Representatives, by resolution, referred the monetary policy statement covering the second half of 2021, supported by the Quarterly Monetary Policy Report, November 2021, Volume 22, Number 2, and the Quarterly Monetary Policy Report, February 2022, Volume 22, Number 3, to the Standing Finance Committee of the whole House of Representatives, consisting of all members of the House, for consideration and report. The monetary policy statement and the report were laid on the table on the 17th of March 2022. Members, the committee is now ready to start its deliberations, and it is our intention to begin with an overview from the Governor of the Bank of Jamaica. After we have heard from the Governor, I will invite the Minister of Finance to open with questions, followed by the opposition spokesperson. Then other members will have the opportunity to make their input. Can we have invite them in for me, please? Mr. Governor, you now have the floor to make your report, give your presentation, but in so doing, you can also introduce the team with you.
Thank you, Chair. I have with me this morning Senior Deputy Governor Wayne Robinson and Deputy Governor Robert Stennett. I want to thank the House for this opportunity. We are here to speak about our monetary policy. My statement today will address some questions about the bank's monetary policy decisions that have been topical over the past several months. These decisions have been taken against the background of developments in the international economy as well as here in Jamaica. In general, the domestic economy continues to show signs of strong recovery. Our foreign reserves are robust and employment is at a record high. However, just as the impact of COVID-19 on economic activity in Jamaica and across the world began to fade, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia delivered another shock to our economy. This conflict fueled further increases in international commodity prices and has led to even higher inflation in Jamaica. At 10.9% at May 2022, inflation continues to exceed target and is expected to continue to do so for the rest of this year into the first half of next year. In addressing this challenge, Bank of Jamaica has gradually raised rates by 500 basis points over the last 9 months, supplied significant US dollar liquidity to the market and to the energy sector, and has kept Jamaica dollar liquidity tight. This package of policy adjustments work in mutually reinforcing ways. First, they cause interest rates in the financial system to rise, which encourages savings versus spending and make saving in Jamaican dollars more attractive relative to foreign currency assets. This helps to stabilize the exchange rate. It also makes borrowing in Jamaican dollars more expensive. Secondly, by using open market operations, which involves Bank of Jamaica issuing more certificates of deposits to banks, removing liquidity from the system and causing money market interest rates to rise. Third, selling foreign exchange to the market in a timely manner when there are temporary gaps between supply and demand. This stabilizes the exchange rate. Selling US dollars also removes Jamaican dollars from the financial system and also causes rates to rise. Taken together, these actions by the central bank help to soften the impact of imported prices, to reduce demand in the economy, and consequently, the ability of businesses to pass on price increases to consumers. What have been the results of these efforts? First, we have seen repo and bank CD rates rise considerably, and banks have started to adjust their deposit and loan rates, or have given notice of future adjustments. The incentive to save and to do so in Jamaican dollars instead of converting to US dollars is therefore improving. Second, the exchange rate has been more stable relative to the recent past. The exchange rate at the end of June of this year compared to December of last year appreciated by 2.3%, about $3.53. Compared to the first half of last year, where there was a depreciation of 4.1%. This stability in the exchange rate is playing an important role in moderating the cost of imported goods and tempering inflation expectations. For perhaps the first time in the history of the bank's survey, the exchange rate was not the major reason for inflation expectations. If we had not taken these actions, inflation would have been even higher, and the impact on workers and the population in general, which is already significant, would be worse. If unchecked, the second-round effects of these commodity price shocks would lead to inflation feeding on itself and creating a wage inflation spiral. This scenario is neither good for consumers nor for businesses. Yes, there is a concern that growth would be adversely affected and that there is a high risk of recession. The bank has been gradual in its rate increases, constantly monitoring the incoming economic data. We are not seeing signs of a recession. Statin just reported that the economy grew by 6.4% in the March 2022 quarter, stronger than the 5.5% that we had projected. We expect that growth will moderate this year, but remain positive in a range of 2% to 4%, driven by a continued recovery in tourism. Of course, a lot depends on what happens in the US. Although the situation is very fluid, the bank shares the views of major forecasters that the likelihood of a recession at this time is low. The IMF, in its recent Article 4 report on the US economy, indicated that they do not see a recessionary environment in the US in the near future. They noted that even if a recession was to occur, however unlikely it may be, it would be relatively short. The US Federal Reserve recent forecast is for growth in the US economy to be in a range of 1.5% to 1.9% for 2022, and in a range of 1.3% to 2% for next year, 2023. While these projections represent lower rates of growth, they do not indicate recession. Looking ahead, the bank expects that, consistent with global consensus forecasts, commodity prices, oils and grains in particular, will fall in the second half of this year, as long as tensions between Russia and Ukraine do not escalate. Along with the impact of BOJ policy measures, we believe this could see inflation return to the target range of 4 to 6% in the second half of 2023. In the meanwhile, Bank of Jamaica and the Monetary Policy Committee will continue to assess the incoming data. Changes in our policy stance will depend primarily on whether there are concrete signs that imported commodity price inflation will fall in the second half of this year as expected, and that core inflation will stabilize. The bank is dedicated to achieving its primary mandate of preserving price stability, which is important in order to protect all Jamaicans and ensure that the economy can continue to grow. High inflation does not help businesses, workers, or the population as a whole. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor and team, a very difficult time for you in the job that you have to do. I can't say it's more difficult than mine, but let me just start. On page 5 of your report, you speak about the awareness of the February 22 report. There's a chart that speaks about awareness of inflation targets and of inflation itself. And it says 62% of persons are not aware of BOJ's inflation target, and 77% indicated they weren't aware of the point-to-point inflation rate. How do you think that this lack of familiarity with this sort of data, does this in any way inhibit the potential effectiveness of the policy, and what ought to be done to ensure that more Jamaicans are aware of these data?
Yeah, I mean, our communications effort is a major, or should be a major part of our inflation fighting efforts generally. Unfortunately, these economic issues sometimes are harder to explain than other issues. But at least the business community, we are in constant dialogue with them, and they are the persons who, by and large, set prices. And what we're very interested in is that in what are their expectations, say 12 months out, about prices. Because they're seeing what imported commodities are like, they're seeing the exchange rate. So every time we have our MPC meeting, we generally have a discussion with the private sector through their various organizations about the survey that we do for inflation expectations, as well as the results as we have seen them.
Okay, so maybe it would be useful, I believe, maybe you have it somewhere else, where we disaggregate the awareness in the business community and awareness among consumers. Both are important, but that's the title of it. That's why I'm, so yeah. So are these? Maybe you can't answer on the spot, but is this these 62% and 77%? Does it refer to the businesses or to consumers?
Yes, it's just the businesses.
Just the businesses.
Right.
So that itself is. We need to do much more. Yeah. Much more, because I mean, you know the theory better than me in terms of expectations feed in behavior, and then the policy responds, and so on. If people aren't aware, then it can limit the impact.
Yes.
Now, and let's speak about that lack of awareness. Because of that lack of awareness and because of other factors as well, there is, some amount of agitation, anxiety, concern, which is quite understandable, that the pace of increase in the policy rate can have a debilitating impact on businesses, on consumers, on people's lives. People have, mortgages and car loans and business loans and so forth. I mean, but you have spoken about sort of trade-offs. I mean, you have the attention of parliamentarians here and all of Jamaica watching. What would you say to those who express that concern? In spite of that concern, you press ahead nonetheless. I mean, is there some greater good that you're after? What would you say to those genuine concerns expressed by a number of Jamaicans as to the impact of higher policy rates on their lives?
Say a couple of words and then I'll ask Wayne to continue. It's really a trade-off between interest rates and your exchange rate. When you really drill down, that's what happens. If we don't have attractive interest rates in Jamaica, and the interest rates in the United States become more attractive as they have been with the Fed raising rates, what you will find is a migration of investments from Jamaican dollars to US dollars. That puts pressure on the exchange rate, enormous pressure, I must tell you, and that will make the exchange rate blow out the rooftop. That, more than anything else, will impact inflation in a disastrous manner. So what we are trying to do, in part, is to make our interest rates attractive enough that people don't feel that they have to take Jamaican dollars, go and buy US dollars to invest in a US dollar asset in order to stay ahead of inflation. Wayne, I don't know if you want to add more.
Well, just to emphasize, underscore that, we are very mindful of this trade-off. And within the bank and the monetary policy committee, we spend a lot of time grappling with this trade-off. But at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, well, if we end up in a situation where, as the governor says, inflation begins to feed on itself, so we no longer have a situation where we are just experiencing a commodity price shock, but everything is rising simply because people see things rising and expect things to continue to rise. That is not an environment that is conducive for growth, because the businessman himself will then start to think about, well, do I invest for the long term, or do I just seek to protect myself and seek more shorter term investments? So over the long haul, over the long term, and not very long, within another 2-3 years, if we end up in a situation where inflation gets out of control and become endemic once more, growth and job creation will also suffer. So we have to now try and make a trade-off, and this is what we have been doing. We have been taking a very gradual approach. At every step we assess, well, how is this impacting growth? What are the growth drivers in the economy? And based on where we see the growth drivers in the economy, yes, there will be a slowdown, but we do not think at this point that it will push the economy into recession. And we therefore think that that sort of slowdown is probably a small price to pay to ensure that we continue to grow over the longer term.
To just add, part of the reason why people are concerned is because we have really moved rates 500 basis points. That's a lot. But we are coming from 0.5, which is unheard of in Jamaica's economy. And so people keep hearing about this pace. But if we were, let's say, at 3% or 4%, I don't think you'd hear as much cries when we moved to 5.5. And why were we at 0.5? We're at 0.5 because we wanted to encourage growth. Right? By lowering interest rates as low as that, the whole idea is that people can afford to borrow, can afford to invest. And that's, so coming from 0.5 now all the way up to 5.5, people are saying, wow, what a lot of movement. I'm concerned, I'm worried. But really, Jamaica, when you look back on it, you could say that if we weren't as committed to encouraging growth, we should have had a policy rate of about 3 to 4%, and then the movement would have been so drastic.
All right, just final question for me in this round. So I just heard you reserve the right to come back in. So heard your responses, Governor and Senior Deputy Governor. But the United States, the Fed has sort of signaled that they will continue to raise rates throughout the rest of 2022 and possibly the beginning of 2023. Given what you said about interest rate differentials and the importance of that as a metric for you, and while I wouldn't want to ask you to commit yourself to the future, but signaling, is important as well. I mean, is it your expectation that if the Fed continues to move, that Jamaica will have to also continue to move?
Not necessarily, in the sense that we started to move early, and the Fed has just done it twice. We have done it 8 times. So we are ahead of the game, and whilst we want to stay ahead of the game, I don't think we have to match each one of their moves. We have some leeway in there. What we're really looking for is commodity prices internationally to start to show some trend downwards. And we're looking for core inflation, which is inflation in Jamaica minus agriculture and minus oil, to see that that too is beginning to change the trajectory and come down. Once we start to see that, we know that we are beginning to win the battle and that we can perhaps pause.
I'll just make a final comment. This is the first test for a independent central bank, and it's a heck of a test for the first test. Hopefully 2 years from now you'll be able to come back and say to this Parliament that your policies achieved the intended aim. I mean, I think that must be the hope of us all. Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah.
Opposition spokesperson.
Thank you. I apologize for the absence of our spokesperson for finance. I think had the meeting been given with a bit more notice, he would have been able to come. Yeah. But we are glad to be here nonetheless. And Governor and your team, welcome to the Standing Finance Committee. I think this is the second time you're presenting to us since the amendments to the Bank of Jamaica legislation. The policy is, of course, very controversial in Jamaica. We have sectors of the business community have come out strongly against it, and some economists in the private sector also suggesting that it's not the appropriate response. The main arguments that have been put forward are the fact that the inflation is largely imported and therefore is not caused by local monetary conditions, and therefore to tighten monetary conditions domestically as a response to imported inflation is going to have other adverse consequences on the economy. And clearly business people who have financed their operations and their expansion by borrowing, in many instances, will see their costs of doing business go up from the very monetary measures that are designed to reduce inflation. So there's that kind of counter-cyclical effect of interest rates going up, which is often kind of, I think, ignored. And there's also the fact that, for example, the tourism sector and other export sectors that rely on being able to convert their earnings in hard currency into local currency to cover their costs, when there's a revaluation of the local currency for them, it increases the cost of doing business. And so they will be seeing that now at a time when many of them are seeking to recover from the impact of the pandemic. So it is a controversial policy. And, you mentioned the critical element of using interest rates to protect the exchange rate, essentially. And that is a long-standing battle that Jamaica has been waging over many years. We were, I think, all thinking that we kind of moved away from that paradigm with the success of the 2013 to 2017 or thereabouts IMF program, where we were able to have, when did the last one end? 2019. So where we had seen a phenomenon of low domestic interest rates, low inflation, and although there was volatility in exchange rate, the interest rates were not the tool that was employed by the BOJ to try and manage that. There were other tools that you were using, including the use of the reserves and selling into the market where necessary and so on, and adjusting things like the cash reserve ratio and that kind of thing. So we're now kind of reverting back, or reverting to the... I know, but I'm trying to speak plain English. So we're reverting to using the interest rate tool to try and manage inflation, the inflationary effects of exchange rate appreciation, and you've seen the success of the policy has been the revaluation of the currency, I think, which is not only as a result of the interest rate hikes, but also the use of the reserves judiciously to manage that process. And I think now this official BOJ buying rate, which is the lower of the two published rates every day, is below 150 to 1, I think it's at 149 or something like that. And the selling rate is just above 150. Coming from 155. The numbers you gave were to the end of June, and there's been a little bit further movement in that direction as well. So my question to you, Governor and team, is how do you assess the impact of the appreciation of the currency on the export sector, including the tourism sector? And secondly, are you satisfied that raising interest rates by 500 basis points in a period of about 8 or 9 months, I think it is, which is a fairly rapid increase over that period of time, whether that, on reflection, is the right response to the inflationary phenomenon that we are encountering, which is largely as a result of the disruption to global supply chains, shipping prices, and commodity price disruptions and increases exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. So having gone through whatever the period is, 8 or 9 months, I think you started in October last year. So over that period, are you satisfied now that, given where we are, that this is something that you need to pursue further? Or is it something that perhaps you could look at pausing now, having gone as far as you've gone, which is a fairly big distance of 500 basis points, 5% per annum over the period? Yeah.
Yes, well, clearly we are closer to where we want to be than we were in October. So from that point of view, member, yes, we thoughts of pausing or how much more do occupy the minds of the MPC a lot, much more now than 6 months ago. I noticed that the same persons who complain about interest rates used to complain about the exchange rate, but they don't anymore. And that's just a fact of life. You have to trade one off against the other. Those very same people are enjoying exchange rate that is stable. It's not fixed. It moves two ways. It's just that it's not as volatile as it used to be. And why is that so? it's so not just because of interest rates being high, but because we manage liquidity in the system too. So when liquidity is tight, it's not easy to get Jamaican dollars to go and buy US dollars. So a combination of interest rates and tightening liquidity, closing down the net open positions of the banks, all those things contribute to more stable foreign exchange rate. Our selling into the market largely has to do with funding energy, mostly. And as you can imagine, the price of energy is tremendous. It's about $500 million US dollars per annum more than what it used to be. So our intervention, particularly for that, is welcomed. There are times, remember, when policy rates were 13%, not the 5%. And those were the days when we were really trying to manage the exchange rate with interest rates. Whereas it has a role to play now at 5%, it's certainly not the 13% that it used to be. So those would be my remarks, Wade.
Just to say, I mean, I don't think the nominal number is necessarily that significant. I think it is the relationship between the policy rate and the inflation rate, and where that, I mean, right now at 5%, it's still negative in real terms because inflation is higher than that. So in a sense, if one is looking at as an investor as to whether to hold local currency or not, you're going to want to see a yield that is higher than the current J-dollar inflation to hold J-dollars. And the BOJ has kind of made that easier to achieve, but not in and of itself achieving it because the rate is lower than current inflation. Yeah. So
if you held US dollars, you still are facing nearly 9% inflation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Investors are facing a hard time generally, whatever currency they are in at the moment. And we just hope, obviously, that things will stabilize and improve. So I think some others may have comments to make. I was just interested in what you thought about the effect of it on the export sector and the tourism sector in particular.
Yes, thanks, Member. The issue of the competitiveness of the exchange rate is one of the factors that we also have to constantly keep an eye on. But if we can recall, during the economic program, I mean, we underwent a painful period where we tried to correct the overvaluation or the uncompetitiveness of the exchange rate. So we underwent a period of, constant depreciation in the exchange rate. And that has allowed us, that adjustment has actually given us some buffer where competitiveness of the exchange rate is actually concerned. The other thing to bear in mind, although the exchange rate, the movement has slowed, not surprising, but you may not realize that the inflation differential between Jamaica and the rest of the world is also still very low. We are at 10-11, US is 8-9%, so it's still very low. So we still have a lot of room in terms of competitiveness. We also look at what is happening to the external accounts, to the current accounts, to our exports and imports, because that is where it shows up. And overall, because of the recovery in tourism, because of strong remittance growth, the external accounts still remain in a very strong position. We're still running very low current account deficits. So we're still very comfortable now as it relates to the competitiveness of the exchange rate. We may lose a little, we may slow a little, but we have some buffer in that regard.
Member Chuck.
When things are not going well, there's enough blame to pass around. Now, if you were within the 4 to 6%, there's no doubt BOJ would get a lot of goodwill and support. Now you're at 10.8%, 10.9%. What proportion of this inflation would you say is due to external factors? I mean, I think from October last year, to the best of my recollection, you anticipated that inflation could become a problem, and you started to move up interest rate. Now, you're being blamed not only for the high interest rate, but for the high inflation. So what we would want to know is how much did the supply chain contributed, because that came about at the end of last year? How much did the Ukraine factor with wheat? Thirdly, the fuel costs, which has gone up over 100% from what was budgeted for approximately. I just want to know so we have a fairly good idea so that we don't put 100% blame to BOJ.
Yeah, our estimate is that the combined impact of all of those factors is around 70% of the inflation. So it is substantial, roughly around 70%. But we also cannot just look at this direct impact. There are second round impacts as well. So whereas we can't control that direct impact, we have an influence on the second round impact. So, and that constitutes two things. So when a good lands here, the Jamaican dollar price matters, and this is where the exchange rate comes in. There's also another component in which other goods that are not necessarily have a heavily import content, other goods, other producers may also raise their prices because they are expecting prices generally to rise as well. So we will see, for example, that rental rates, for example, which has nothing to do with commodity price, rental rates will go up because people are trying to protect themselves, to protect their income. It is those effects that the bank and its monetary policy is actually trying to dampen. We can't affect the main shock if oil price goes up, but how it ripples through and how it affects the rest of the economy, that's what we're trying to temper.
So is there any position that BOJ can take to reduce that 30% which you're anticipating in terms of rental rates, in terms of, price, people are hurting. So the question is there anything that BOJ can do to ease or to reduce even that 30% which you probably believe is internal, domestic?
So this is what our policy actions are meant to do. And as the governor would have indicated, we have a three-pronged approach in terms of our strategy. One is to adjust interest rates, because we have to change relative prices. The other is that we have been a lot more aggressive in ensuring adequate supply of foreign exchange in the market so that the exchange rate would be less volatile and more stable. And also we are constraining the amount of Jamaican dollar liquidity that's available in the system.
So
Member Guy.
There are blunt tools, if I could say that. They're not scalpels that you can use in surgery. They're very blunt. And so they have side effects that are undesirable because it impacts growth. But the idea is to slow down demand, take some of the demand out of the economy and let prices settle off a little bit. So it has a positive and a negative effect, unfortunately.
Governor. Thank you, Chair. Just two comments I have. The Minister of Finance mentioned it earlier on, Leader of the Opposition, the very transformative approach you had in terms of the PR and the inflation targeting. And we are seeing here now where if you use as the leader would say, the dancehall term, it flop. Because 67% of the businesses, right, did not know about it in terms of what you had expected them to know. To be curious to know what the ordinary consumers, the percentage for them. So in light of that, what new measures or what new PR strategies you are going to introduce to continue on that road for the information? Secondly, and forgive me my ignorance, it might sound, because I never schooled in economics, but I see here that all of what we are getting is a sort of textbook approach to the economy here. And when you consider that the vast majority of the inputs in our economy are imported, you mentioned, Governor, that oil contributed a significant portion of the effects of what is happening now. Raw material that we import for even the tourism sector comes from abroad. Are the measures the right measures? And I say textbook because this is what I understand, that these are the usual responses when you have that. But those are for economies that do not have such heavy reliance on imports.
What I would say is, if we had not taken the steps that we have, what do you think inflation would be in Jamaica? If we had not raised interest rates, not tightened liquidity, not closed down the banks, NOPs, where do you think inflation would be today? You could start at an exchange rate of, call a number, 170, 175. Do you know what impact that has on inflation? If everybody could get Jamaican dollars cheap because rates are low, and buy US dollars with it, and then migrate their investments with it, where do you think inflation in Jamaica would be? So whilst the results are not what we want it to be, in that we have 10.9, it's better than the 15, 17, 20 that we might have had we not taken the steps that we have.
Member Hilton.
Oh, the PR.
Member Hilton.
Sorry. You know, when we do this survey of businesses, it's not just the Grace Kennedys and the Separads that we do. It's a man on a corner. It's a small merchant. It's those people who are not as au fait. So every month, although we discuss these matters intensely with the various business organizations, the man on the corner is not aware of it. And it's going to take a quite ingenious campaign to make them understand what 4 to 6% means and why it is important. You know, the why is really important. I remember we were on a pretty successful program 2 years ago about inflation, not too high, not too low. And a lot of people liked it. It had a popular side to it. I think yes, internationally, we won an award for it. I think we have to look back on that and see how can we break down some of these economic facts into popular language that everybody can understand. Not easy.
Member Hannah.
Thank you. Morning, Governor. Morning to your Deputy Governor and team. I'm following on from what my colleague said, and I remember, they say hindsight is 20/20, because I remember, Mr. Chairman, back in 2016, when we were on that side, and Governor, we were at the time very, very excited about letting the country understand about reversing a 40-year deficit trending spend, a 7% fiscal surplus, and we were talking about these very big economic achievements that we had that was stabilizing the macroeconomic environment on the whole. The rest is history. The PMP lost 14 seats. Why I raise it is because I wonder if financial literacy sometimes is not the real crisis that we have in Jamaica. I think everybody is, Mr. Chairman, clear that the pandemic, the price of oil, all of those external factors, the fertilizer, the lack of access to wheat, all of those have an impact. And we are aware that these things have to be done. But I think the question I have to ask, given that background and context, if their purchasing power is going to be reduced, it is already being reduced because of the inflation, and these measures are to also encourage savings. Many of the ordinary Jamaican people don't have the ability to save. It is also going to impact their car loans, their higher purchase rates on small loans that they take out to buy furniture. All of those things, Governor, at some point, it might not kick in tomorrow. And the question I have for you is, while we can sit here and we talk about it and we understand it, the PR is one thing, but we have to get persons to understand what is coming, because when the banks start to give those letters that their mortgage rates have moved, their car loan payments have moved, their higher purchase rates have moved, their wages are not moving in tandem with that increase. And I want you to consider that as a part of your PR campaign, because at the end of the day, we want everybody to understand that these measures are important if we are going to really straddle and prevail in what I would say is a perfect storm internationally, with everybody experiencing these issues.
Yes, unfortunately, that is the byproduct of high interest rates that hurt people who perhaps can't afford it. The mortgage rates will rise somewhat, and higher purchase rates will rise. Car loan rates will rise. Hopefully, not for too long, because what we want to see is inflation bend the curve and start to come down in a decisive way. It will help a lot if we see international commodity prices come down. But in any event, if we see core inflation start to come down here in Jamaica, well, that is also a very positive sign for us. So I'm hoping, remember, that it won't be long that we have to endure high interest rates, and that we can return more towards the growth path that we were on. But it really depends on us seeing in a convincing way that inflation is turning a corner.
Member Hilton.
Yeah, thanks much. Well, you've raised a very important issue, and it is something that we have been working on. The bank houses the National Financial Inclusion Secretariat.
Yeah.
And one of the focus of the Secretariat is a financial literacy campaign. So we have been doing a number of things, both in print and electronic media. So, for example, we've started to focus on what happens when you want to open an account, what happens with simplified customer due diligence. So we're trying to educate the people, provide more information on that.
I know some of the things, but if I can just say, going to TikTok, IG, get some of the persons to help you to do it.
Yes, that is on the card. But you also made an important point in terms of trying to educate the populace as to what to come in terms of the economic environment, what it implies for the individual, not just at a macro level, but what it implies for a householder, for a household worker, for a domestic worker, for somebody who is selling coconut. And we do take that on board. We think that's very important.
Member Hilton.
Thank you, Chairman. Governor and team, I accept that your task is an unenviable one right now. I have two questions. The first is, what is your view on the strongly held concern among professionals that interest rate itself feeds the inflation. Do you have a clear view on that? And if it is, what is it?
Yes, of course, for any business that has borrowed, higher interest rates will raise their costs. That's without doubt. The real question, though, is the alternative worse for them, or is it better? And I would posit that it's better that we take the high interest rate cost on board, and we have an exchange rate that is more stable, and that impacts. You take the average commodity that gets imported in here. When you add duties, markup, handling, that change in a exchange rate, $1, $2, balloons out when it gets to the final consumer into several more dollars. So somebody has to pay the price as we make this change in policy. And unfortunately, it's the persons who borrow that will pay the higher interest rate. But it is in order to make it easier for the rest of the population who depend on a lot of these commodities that are imported.
Just following up quickly, because this next question I had is, even as the Minister of Tourism continues to, my good friend, work very hard and providing some macro output, the issue of the small tourism, the small firms in the tourism sector, and what is happening, even as we, as you said, somebody have to pay the price. My concern is that these persons who, in the normal pursuit of business, have to borrow and have borrowed, again, to grow what is one of our primary growth sector, driver of growth. Now, following on the pandemic, they were put in a very difficult position. A number of them remain in a very difficult position. And the policy stance of the BOJ, that the blunt instrument, as you have admitted, is not helping that subgroup within a thriving sector, a growing sector. And the Minister of Finance is here, and I know the monetary tools are not by themselves enough. I'm sure you're looking sideways at him for some fiscal help in addressing this situation, but how are we going to address what is an important part in an important sector with these tools?
Yeah, so, I could liken what we're going through now to a Category 5 hurricane. That's what it is. In the United States, they have not had inflation like this for, 50 years, 40, 50 years. This is a Category 5 hurricane that we are enduring and trying to survive. There is a price that has to be paid at some point, but it's for the greater good. And until someone can convince me that had we done nothing, had we left interest rates low, that we would be better off, then until then I believe we are in a better place than we may have been had we not pursued the policies that we have.
My observation, Governor, is not that. I think people are now saying, as I understand it, persons are now saying, what's done is done, firstly. The question is how we proceed and whether a balance is what we need, and has a balance been struck. I think that's where I understand the conversation is.
Yes, and believe you me, MPC, we agonize about it, and as we have left the 0.5 behind and got to 5 and 5.5, it becomes even more agonizing as to whether we go any further or not. It's not a decision that we take lightly. It's not a textbook issue. A lot of real-life experiences and feedback come into whether we move rates or we don't. Again, let me say, I am hopeful that we will see commodity prices break for the better in the second half of this year. That's what the international experts say. I don't have any reason to doubt them. If that happens, it will allow our inflation curve to turn the corner and start to head down. When we see that, and when we see core inflation also start to come down, then we will be in a better position to determine whether we pause or not.
Member Wilson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Governor, for illuminating us on what's happening at the BOJ. I have three specific questions. One relates to the tools that you are implementing and how it will affect GDP growth for 2022-2023. You mentioned something about recession, and I've heard it as well. And I wanted to know whether, and I think you have tried to illuminate some notes on it, whether we are looking at the possibility of a recession in Jamaica if we continue with these policies. That's the first question. The second one, how does Jamaica compare with our Caribbean neighbors in our response to what's happening globally? Specifically, whether it relates to economies with similar size or just our Caribbean neighbors. And the last one, you mentioned that we will continue to see these policies being implemented into 2023. Is this assumption made on the premise that the global action that's taking place in Ukraine will end, or is it just a general premise? So I want to know where or how did you come up with that particular assumption? Thank you.
GDP growth for 22-23, we maintain should be positive and in the region of about 2 to 4%. A big part of that growth has to do with recovery to pre-pandemic levels. So tourism has shown us a strong recovery so far. If it continues for the fiscal 22-23, that will drive growth in a considerable way. In the alumina sector, the return of Jamaica to active production would also help considerably. And these are export sectors that don't have any effect, don't suffer any effect from domestic interest rates. So we expect that the external sector or export sectors will be robust and strong and help to drive growth in 22-23.
Just follow up on that, Governor. So would that mean that we are still recovering from the pandemic, the growth rate, and we're not actually experiencing additional growth pre-pandemic? I just want to understand the scope of the growth that you're referring to.
Yes, I mean, in tourism, for example, we month for month, Minister can correct me, we have reached pre-pandemic levels, but for the 12 months gone, we have not. So 22-23 will see further recovery in tourism, so too in bauxite alumina. I wanted to just say something about Barbados. So I think the last number I have for Barbados inflation was close to about 9%, 8-9%. So pretty close to where we are, a little more than the US, I believe, so they may be about 10. But in Jamaica, any Jamaican can go to the bank and say, I would like to buy US dollars, and you will get it. You can't do that in Barbados. They have a different system. So their system with a fixed exchange rate means that maybe the inflation rate to the normal consumer is a little lower, but they have no access or very limited access to foreign exchange. I think Jamaica has gone beyond that point now, for more than a decade, and Jamaicans generally and businessmen in particular expect to be able to access US dollars, to make investments, to buy commodities, to let their businesses run smoothly. So in a way, that's a big difference between Barbados and ourselves. They may have a smaller inflation rate, but not much less than we do.
Bye-bye.
So the third question, which was pertaining to the projection that you made, because in your preamble you mentioned that we should see this particular policy being implemented until 2023. So I was wondering on what assumption was that made? Was it made on the assumption that the issue in Ukraine would have been resolved and there's some global normalcy, or would we be looking at normalizing international trade where products and goods start to flow in different channels? So I'm trying to understand, the rationale behind that one.
Well, if the Russia-Ukraine situation doesn't get any worse, it means that inflation, the strong inflation tendency that arose from that conflict in February, March, April, that becomes normalized and is not a big impact on future inflation. So to the extent it doesn't get any worse, we have a fighting chance to turn the inflation corner. If it gets worse, then that's really a big problem for Jamaica, for our trading partners, and for inflation generally the world throughout. Not sure I answered everything you wanted.
Leader.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, just to allow me to thank the Governor and his team. I think it's a great presentation.
House Leader.
No, we're not finished. Oh. No, that's just the prelude to my questions. So allow me to thank you, Governor, and your team for this very extensive presentation, which has covered much of the concerns that are evident in the demand management. And I make point on that because there's the other side of the equation, which I wondered if there are any thoughts on, the supply side. Because whilst we know that your mandate heavily is driven on demand management as your tool for inflation control, the supply side is a great tool also. And I just wondered if there are any thoughts that you had on the supply side that might be helpful in the way forward. I mean, I'm driven by that, as you know, because my industry is a hugely consumption-oriented industry. I am hugely, well, I say the propensity to consume in tourism is the highest of all industries in the world. And so supplies is important to us. And so whilst we can continue to give you the growth that you're getting, if the supply side is not attended to, we will have some concerns.
And the impact that we have on the supply side is exchange rate. To the extent that the exchange rate is fairly stable, it minimizes the impact of that supply inflation. But that's about all we can do. We can't grow the wheat and we can't produce the oil.
I wondered in the mix of it all, what monetary or other policy mix could be looked at to incentivize production so that the supply side could be enhanced. Agriculture, in my context, agriculture is a huge driver. 42% of the expenditure of the visitors is on food. So agriculture is critical if we're to strongly retain the dollar in the economy. So I just wondered about that in the context of this discussion, because I know there are people out there who are concerned that, yes, okay, the monetary policies are here, strong, hard, yes, we understand it. But what are the policy options that are there for production and enhancement of supplies?
That question may be a bit above the pay grade of Bank of Jamaica.
Member Paulwell.
Chairman, you know, the member has preempted me because I was about to remark on how civil, how what we're doing here today truly depicts the type of independence that we're striving for, and that I was quite pleased to see the minister asking the questions, because you no longer do that in your closed-door office. But I believe, similarly, that the Bank of Jamaica might have some concerns too, because everything is everything. And so you have monetary policy, you have fiscal policy. And I would certainly like to hear whether or not they have any concerns on the other side of that equation. And I think it is only well and good that we address them frontally in this way. So I'm hoping that the governor will answer that. But the second question has to do with your function in relation to the banking sector. One of the problems I believe we face in Jamaica is a lack of competition in the banking sector. That has assisted in driving some inflation. And there is this concept called KYC, and each bank hides behind that in relation to enabling customers to be able to have portability. There was a problem one time with these phones. Digicel couldn't work with Flow, and we solved the problem by enabling number portability, so you can move between the players. You can't do that in the banking sector. For you to open an account, and I'm not speaking to those who are politically connected, I'm speaking to the ordinary Jamaican. I'm not advocating my cause today. But we have to find a way. And I remember, as the director of the Fair Trading Commission some years ago, when we did an analysis of the financial sector, it was clear that apart from price fixing and all the other breaches that you would contend with the Fair Competition Act, it is quite clear that the regulations that they uphold seem to prevent them from enabling greater competition. And I'm wondering if at this stage, especially with the frustration that members here who have been advocating for new rules, if the Bank of Jamaica couldn't step in and offer some guidance, so that if one bank has seen the hurdle being cleared by its customers, why can't that apply across the board to enable portability in the various accounts? So probably might want to address the first part first, yes, which is to ask the minister any question you wish, and then to deal with that other question.
Well, what I would say is that the minister's policies and how he manages his revenues and his expenditures pose no threat at this time to the Bank of Jamaica and our objectives. So I'm not commenting on that part. When we're out of this room, maybe we can talk about that. But the fiscal tightness is in alignment with what we want to achieve with our policies. The lack of competition, I agree with you 100%. It's even more than you may think at first sight, because there's an asymmetry in the banking system where one or two banks have 70 or 75% of the business. So although there are 11 DTIs, really the sector is run by just a couple of them. And this is a major concern to us. Now, we can't solve it quickly, immediately. Over the years, what we have tried to do speaking Bank of Jamaica, is licensing more and more players. But we have found that what that does is creates more small banks, and that the small banks never really get a chance to grow to become really big competitive banks. And part of that reason is because the deposits are stuck in the institutions that control the 70%. Some form of portability would help. Would it cure it entirely? I'm not absolutely sure, because people have traditions, and their mother, father, granny used to bank with this one, and so they stay there. They think it's safer. But if you had portability and you could go to a bank and say, I want to open an account at this other bank, please send my KYC information over, and it has to be done electronically and can be done in 24 hours. I think that would help. It may not solve it all, but it would help. And to the extent it will help, we should do it. And so we have embarked on a program to try to get that done. Now, why does the KYC in one bank not be sufficient for KYC in another bank? Comes right down to this business of AML, CFT, anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing. For a country like Jamaica, especially for a country like Jamaica that is on the grey list, Minister knows about it intimately. We have to be ultra careful with how we have customers in our banking institutions, because at the drop of a hat we can lose our correspondent banking relations. So the fact that Bank X thinks that Mr. Paulwell is a good customer, Bank Y wants to do that KYC all over because they don't want that it turns out that the customer is not good and their correspondent bank severs relations with them. So you have the situation where Jamaica is one of those countries where everybody wants to do their own KYC. Having NIDS, or whatever the new form of it will be, will help, because it will be a universal form of identification of any particular customer, so they don't have to have their electric bill, their water bill, a state recommendation from a JP. This is a government-sanctioned form of identification that any institution can take as bona fide. If that is what we end up with, then it will help a lot to onboard people easily. It will also help with making KYC portable. But that is something that we have to work towards in the next year or two. The Financial Services Protection Bill that this House will see shortly, I don't know when, it's out of BOJ, it's with the ministry, is a vitally important bill that I hope the House will treat with expeditiously, because it is in that bill that more rules and regulations will be set for how banks operate. And I think every member of Parliament is going to be interested to see that that is an effective form of oversight.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Governor. We have one last question from member Montague. We have a time of 12 o'clock cut off, and so we want to wrap up.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you. Governor and the team, thank you very much. Quick question. Is the BOJ the regulator for the banking system? No?
Yes, we're a regulator for them in some respects, not in every respect.
Why not in every respect?
Well, we don't have the authority in our banking act to speak to them about fees and interest rates and so forth.
But in terms of banking standards, you would be the regulator. Basic minimum standards of service?
No, this Financial Services Protection Bill will do that in much greater detail. I don't know that there's anything in our act that would allow us to specify anything to do with the quality of their service.
Because, for example, the utilities have the OUR, and they are held to certain minimum standards in terms of service delivery. So you are telling us that the banks do not have a similar system yet?
Right. The authority that we have has to do with monetary policy and financial stability in the banking system, not in respect of customer service. That's what this new bill is going to help us to do.
But so then, Governor, if a customer of any bank licensed by whether you are whichever authority is not satisfied with the level of service, what's their recourse?
If I may come in here, Governor, because this is a gap in the system in that we have a Consumer Affairs Commission that deals with industry overall, but we don't have consumer affairs specifically for the financial services industry, which is why this bill that the Governor alluded to is going to address consumer protection in financial services and empower the BOJ to enforce those standards. So it's a gap that needs to be addressed and is being addressed with this bill that we hope to come to Parliament within the next several months.
So,
in other words, Minister, you are telling us that right now, if a customer feels undone by a bank, they have no recourse.
Yeah, if I could just add, I mean, in the Banking Services Act, there's a code of conduct.
You need use
code of
mic.
conduct
Yeah.
that requires the bank to provide certain basic information and set some standards in terms of dealing with customer complaints. But even that code needs significant strengthening. And this is what this new bill will seek to do.
Mr. Deputy Governor, that code is more in protection of the bank, not the consumer. So, for example, the banks in rural St. Mary have all gone cashless. Suddenly, without a thought for the people, their customers, my voters, my constituents. And the people are now left with a situation where you can't get cash, you can't get banking service, the ATM machines are not working. So who compensates? You now have a system where a third party is getting access to the people's information. There are cases that I brought to the minister's attention where persons make a lodgement at the ATM. It is picked up by the third party, but yet not credited to the customer's account for months. And then the banks charge the customer a fee for overdraft. So where can this customer run to for protection?
Well, I mean, if we got a complaint like that in writing, we would certainly speak to the bank in question and ask them to give us a response to that within a reasonable time frame. That kind of clearly egregious action, I think we would be happy to take up with the banks. And to the best of my knowledge, they would try to address an issue like that.
Governor, unfortunately, to the best of my knowledge, they have not addressed the customers' complaints. And it gets worse. A second lodgement has been lost from the same customer. And also, what I would like to bring to your attention in terms of confidentiality, a customer opens an account after much difficulty with a bank, and you enter into a confidential relationship. And the bank on its own takes up your money and information, account information, and give it to a third party, give it to a security company to do that part of the banking transaction without permission from the customer. What if that security company sells the customer's information to an ad company? What's the recourse for the customer? Because the governor, No, not legal. These are questions that the ordinary Jamaicans in my constituency are faced with. And the people voted for me for a reason, because they couldn't come and voice their own concerns. No, we're not. No, please don't trivialize this, because people out there are suffering. Leader of the opposition, for example, there's a gentleman.
I'm not trivializing. I'm suggesting that the issues you've raised have some legal ramifications, and the depositors who have suffered from that need some assistance to get a resolution to that. That's all I'm suggesting.
Thank you, sir. But I'm also saying we have a responsibility as lawmakers. And for example, there is a gentleman in Geisel that got his pay. It was credited to his account. The ATM in Geisel is not working. He chose to go to Highgate, 12 miles away, and joined the line at the ATM, and 2 persons ahead of him, as they're about to get in, it ran out of cash. He left Highgate and went to Port Maria. The ATM is down. He cannot get access to his little minimum wage pay. Now he has a bus fare to pay without money. How do we treat with that these little sufferings? You know, we can talk about this macroeconomy and all of those wonderful and fancy things. But when the tire hits the road, it is the people who are suffering, Governor. I know, but what are we going to do? You're going to tell me you're going to bring the law come next week? But in the meantime, Governor, there's a hardship. So for example, Governor, if I lodge money to be credited to my account, and if 1 cent is not credited, can you imagine if 1 cent is taken from every single saving account in Jamaica? You know how much money is that? So what about the standard to make sure that every single cent that an old lady deposits is actually credited to her account?
I mean, everybody should have the very last cent, absolutely. Member Montague, I would just say that if you have a specific case of clear injustice and you write to me on it, I personally will undertake to take it up with the banks and to see what we can do about it.
I will write to you, sir, but I am now speaking of the whole parish of St. Mary. The whole parish. People are facing hardship. And in addition to that, because you can't get to your cash, the Bank of Jamaica, in my view, needs to have some standards. How many ATMs per population should be allowed? Should other private sector players be given access to the banking network so they too can put up the white face ATMs? Because the ATMs are now married to a bank. Why can't we open up the system to allow it? How do you service and maintain? What are the standards? Because, Governor, it is not easy for a vendor in Gale you sell your stuff, then you end up with the money. There's nothing to do with the money but to keep it at home. You're inviting criminals. And these are the issues, Governor, that I'm making an appeal that you, in your meeting with the banks, that they lengthen the transitionary period for cashless. It is something that is good. It is something that is coming. But we have to be mindful of the local conditions. Because, Governor, the average person 50, 60 years and over, find it extremely difficult to navigate the ATMs. Extremely difficult. And it strips them of their dignity, Governor. When an old lady or an old man have to call sometimes a stranger or even their own family and to give them their PIN number. You know, many old people don't want their children to know how much the balance in their account. But we strip them of that dignity. And then the worst thing, Governor, after the long wait, the machine ran out of cash.
Thank you, Member Montague. Final.
But Chairman, you didn't allow the government. We just talk around this thing and we're not coming to a resolution. When I leave here and go back to St. Mary, people want answers. That's why they vote for us. You know? Not to just have some big talk and shake your head and finish. Today, as we speak, people are facing these hardships, and it is my job to bring it here, not just to bring it, to hear it, but to bring it to get a resolution.
Member, I do agree with you. I do face some of those same challenges. You have heard the challenges here today. The governor have made note of it. The minister made mention of the bill that is to come before us that will address 99% of what you're saying. And I suspect that hearing all that you have said, that both parties, BOJ and the ministry, will now take into consideration what you have said and to tweak it in such a way that it becomes a part of the final draft or bill that is going to come to us. So I am 100% with you, and also from another standpoint that I will use the HR committee to vent it a lot more than what has been vented here today. So just give us the opportunity, because of the time constraint that we are now faced with, for us to come back to you.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, Ms. Gatta in Gale is not worried about a time constraint about 11 o'clock. We were sent here to represent them. Let me remind. And today, yesterday, last week, last month, even Keisha, that the minister always talk about, is facing difficulties. What about them? These people have invested their votes in us to make life better for them, not to put on hardships, Mr. Chairman. And I'm saying some of the things we don't have to wait until the minister tables his new bill. The simple matter of having standards, service standards. Simple matter of extending the transition to cashless. That don't need no law. The governor tells us all the way that he meets with the banks. We must bank with a heart.
One big bank is more cashless. It's not fair. One big bank is more cashless.
Thank you very much, member. Again, I must say to us that we are still under the constraint of the time. We are going to have member Burke.
But Chairman, with all due respect, sir, we were elected for 5 years, not until 12 o'clock. And I came here from St. Mary to hear these matters and to get some resolution, not to come here till 12 o'clock. That's not what the people send me here from Western St. Mary. Are you saying that the people's business is not as important, that we have to run out of here by 12?
The people's business are very much important. Noted, member. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try to be economical what I have to say. But two things struck me. One is really that a heartfelt plea from my former colleague, councillor, you know? And I know that councillors are close to the people, and so even as Member of Parliament, we tend to keep that attitude. But it struck me that some of the issues that you raise, which are in fact alarming, are similar in nature to those issues raised by Member Fitzjackson, in terms of the banking bill that he has been carrying for as long as he has been carrying. And I want to juxtapose that with also what the governor and the minister said about the bill that is to come. And it suddenly struck me, and it's just two issues that are dealing. This is one. It suddenly struck me, Minister, that it might be because of this contemplation of this bill to come, why we have treated with such scant regard the bill being carried by Member Jackson. And I'll be honest, it hit me in a way that sometimes we talk about how we work together and across the island resolving these issues. But Lord, man, can we just be honest in the conversation we are having to say, listen, you know, we're doing this, we're doing that, so kind of hold your foot a little bit because so-and-so. But I also want to go back to the point made by Member Montague, that we're all sent here with a mandate. And when individuals take the time to think through and to put solutions on the table in exercise of that mandate, We need to respect it and treat it a little differently than we have been doing. So I just really want to say that. So that is one. Then the other, and I'm honest in saying that I'm not sure whether the question is above your pay grade or for you, Governor. But as I thought about all that has been said, which I think has been really very useful information to just kind of put everything in context and to put the reasoning behind some of the policies that you have been exercising or putting in place, it also hit me that there is a portion of Jamaicans that are severely and negatively impacted by the policies because so many of our people really work in the informal sector. Now, they might not be directly impacted, but in terms of generally now and in terms of how those policies affect others with services that they have to engage with. Yes, we sometimes operate as if we only have the formal sector to deal with, and there is not this informal sector and how what we do impact on them. And I was wondering if there was any consideration. I know it's a bigger part of the economy, but I was just wondering if any attention has been given to that, how they figure in what we're doing and what we're saying, and whether they really are as invisible as they feel.
I mean, I would say that our policies can't distinguish between the various segments of the business community. If interest rates rise, they rise for everybody. That's why we say it's a blunt instrument. I keep saying, hopefully, it won't be high for long. If it has to be for an extended period of time, I think we all will have to contemplate, are there any other measures that can alleviate the stress? But it's not possible to separate out a particular set of business people, small corner shops, whatever, and address their issues more than the big businesses. Unfortunately, it's the same tool that applies to them all.
Please don't get me wrong, I understand that, which is why I said that maybe you're not the one to whom I should have been addressing. But I'm saying because in this parliament certainly are those who have the responsibility and have the wherewithal to address some of those things. Yeah. And I'm just really probably saying that there is this other sector that we don't talk often enough about in here. And I think that especially now, we need to pay some attention there as well.
Thank you very much, member. At this time, we are very, very much out of time. And if I take you, I have to take Madam Malahu. And so we just have to cut at this time. Thanks for coming, Governor, and your team. We do hope that at another forum we may have to invite you to come back to us to explain in more detail. And by that time, you will have some more answers to the question that were raised by Member Montague. So thanks again for coming this morning.
Chairman, are you saying in 2 weeks' time? And if I think Minister Vaz had indicated he wanted to say something. But in 2 weeks' time, the governor will be back with some answers?
Member, you're talking out of turn now.
No, I'm asking. Mr. Chairman, the people are watching us.
I agree, and it is noted. It is noted, member, and I did say.
I'm just asking a question.
We will convene that meeting, which is the HR meeting that we can vent all of that information.
So no, but all the matters we vented today.
With all due respect,
will the governor come back to us with an answer in 2 weeks' time?
At that meeting.
Thank you, sir.
Members, the report of the Standing Finance Committee on its deliberation on the monetary policy statement covering the second half of 2021, supported by the quarterly monetary policy report, November 2021, volume 22, number 2, and the quarterly monetary policy report, February 2022, volume 22, number 3, is before us. Is it the wish of the committee that I sign the report? Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay.
Members, please be seated.
Chairman, I now move that the meeting of the Standing Finance Committee be adjourned, sine die.
The question is that the meeting of the Standing Finance Committee be adjourned, sine die. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. This meeting now stands adjourned.